A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here with Paul Formosa, a professor of philosophy, head of the Department of Philosophy, and co-director of the Center for Agency, Values, and Ethics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Paul has published widely on topics in moral and political philosophy, with a recent focus on ethical issues raised by new technologies such as video games and AI. He also collaborates regularly with colleagues from a range of different disciplines outside of philosophy, one of whom is our other guest today, Malcolm Ryan. Malcolm Ryan is course director of the Game Design and Development Program in the School of Computing at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. By the way, we love our Aussies. We've had so many Aussies in this show. You guys do some really interesting stuff. Malcolm has published in game design, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence. His current research focuses on how players make ethical decisions in video games in collaborations with colleagues from philosophy, psychology, and creative writing. He blogs about video game ethics research at moralityplay.org. So both of you guys really do collaboration with people from other fields, which is fantastic, and they're here to talk to us together. Right? The research together is really founded in moral psychology and user experience or UX research. They're interested in how players engage morally with games, how they exercise their ethical thinking to make decisions in games, and how they experience these games, these kinds of decisions. The hope is that this research will lead to richer, more engaging ethical content in games, both for entertainment and education. And wow, that was a very long introduction. Malcolm and Paul, welcome to the show. Yeah!
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Our episode is how what you've learned about moral psychology can help video games better engage with ethics. So to set things up clearly for our listeners, what is moral psychology?
So essentially, moral psychology is the study. I like to think of it as it's how we do morality when we're doing morality. So as thinking creatures, when we're being moral, we've got various processes going on in our mind trying to work out how we do what we do when we're moral. And so it's different from philosophical ethics in that it's not asking sort of theoretically what is ethics or what is right and wrong. It's more asking, okay, you're sitting down, you're making an ethical decision. What is going on in your head when you're doing this? And I'm really interested in it because I think, these are the questions we as game designers think about all the time, is how does player think about what they're doing when they're playing our game? So in this case, the game is a moral problem of some sort.
Yeah, in a nutshell, what are we doing when we're...
What are we doing? Paul, do you want to...
Well, I guess we'll get into it as we go along. But I just want to... I agree with Malcolm's kind of definition there. And when we think about moral psychology in games, it's pretty straightforward. So how are people making those moral decisions in games? What sort of things influence those decisions? For example, things like morality meters or the design of the game, the different characters they interact with, and so on. And the other thing we also want to think a little about in moral psychology is also things about sort of moral development and moral engagement. So, when we're thinking about moral psychology, we're also thinking how can people change or get better or worse? And we can also think about how games, by engaging with games, we might be able to make it either better or worse, and what sort of different design strategies or techniques will interact or engage with those moral capacities. And that's the sort of things we've been trying to look at, I suppose.
Okay, so sort of historically, both in philosophical ethics and also in the psychology, there's sort of been two contrasting approaches to thinking about how do we do this. And one is the more rational, morality is about thinking about certain rules and certain and working out how to apply those. And so it's historically a very sort of rationalist approach to how do we do morality, and we sit down and we solve moral problems. The alternative approach is sort of thinking about morality more as character or more as sort of intrinsic, intuitive things. And some people will go so far as saying, all of that rationalization is just post hoc rationalization of what we emotionally want or don't want, and we just say. modern moral psychology seems to sort of prefer what's called a dual process model, which is like the thinking fast and slow model that people are familiar with from Kahneman's research and so forth, where we do have these rational processes, and sometimes we sit down and we do rationalize out our moral responses, but we also have these intuitive moral responses and automatic moral responses. And a lot of what we're doing in real life, we don't have the opportunity to sit down and do the moral math. We just make decisions automatically. And so this is sort of the model that informs what we're doing, is thinking about, we do have these times when we sit down and we really nut out a moral choice, but we also have times where we're just sort of reacting morally to things. And so then using that sort of psychological model, and then there's sort of more detailed theories about the different components of that and what we're doing when we're doing that.
Okay. Games obviously can present you with lots of different opportunities, right, to engage both of those kind of ways of thinking. Though when most people think of how video games try to engage the players with ethics, I think what they typically tend to think about is morality meters, or of like big moral dilemmas with a lot of lives at stake. Like, my favorite are from the Mass Effect games that give you action options to choose from, and then you get rated for your actions as Paragon or Renegade or good or evil or something like that. And they affect your character's moral alignment on some sort of morality meter or something like that. Your research shows that this sort of focus is too narrow, right? That there's other aspects of our moral expertise. And you'll notice I use this word moral expertise as if it's clear, as if we know what that means, that you engage with. So before we talk about kind of a, moral expertise, what exactly are morality meters? And are they really substantially different types of morality meters?
So, they've been around in some sort of moral accounting in games. It's been around at least since the early Ultima games, where you get points for goodness or evilness in the game. I guess morality meters really kind of first appeared as a very clear on-screen mechanic in Knights of the Old Republic. I think that was the first game that had an explicit meter on the screen that was telling you how many points of good or evil you had, and as you made decisions in the game, that was reflected. And so, essentially, at its core, there are lots of variations on this, and lots of games that have some moral accounting going on, where the behind the scenes are explicitly presented to you. But when we're talking about morality meters, we're mostly, and especially in the research we're doing, we're talking about very visible on-screen, very explicit meter showing you, yes, this decision resulted in you getting 10 points of good, this decision resulted in you getting negative 10 points or 10 points of evil, and your meter starts somewhere at 0 and moves towards good or evil as the game assessing your moral character in some sense based on your choices. And there are a lot of games that do have this as a very explicit mechanic in the game.
Would you count the giant beast in black and white as a moral meter?
Yeah, so it's definitely a kind of moral accounting going on there. It's showing it, and similarly with I think Fable does it much more in terms of showing your avatar changing and expressing it in that way. And so there are definitely more subtle ways of showing this sort of thing, but still behind the scene there's some value in the game, which is you are currently at 20 points of good, and that is represented on the screen somehow visually. We're looking at very explicit meters because, we wanted, for starting out research, we wanted to just say, this is the thing, see how it affects people's decisions. But ultimately, there are lots of ways this can be done. I guess a related mechanic is the kind of reputation mechanics that you see in games like Fallout New Vegas and other games like that, where it's less explicitly about telling you your overall good or evil and more about, well, this faction or this individual regards you as good and which allows you to, as a designer, to present more than one axis of morality, which is, again, something we haven't gone into yet. Something I'm interested in exploring further is what if we have different morality meters so far we have sort of looked at having one morality meter, but having it express different kinds of morality. But it would be interesting in further research to look at, well, you've got this meter which tells you according to this person's standards you're a good person, but according to this person's standards you're less good, or so forth.
Right. To me, yeah, those two things seem dramatically different, and it makes sense. You guys would separate them. One is judging you very explicitly. The other one is not so much judging you, but kind of letting you know that you have a reputation, right, among different groups, and allows you for reputation management rather than to kind of mess with your, I don't know, overall alignment. It depends how you look at it, or overall character. So tell us about the studies that you guys did, right? You ran a study of morality meters, and it included creating a game specifically for that purpose. What did you guys learn about how users interact with morality meters?
So our aim was to just look at, very basically, because there's a lot of conversation in the research about how morality meters are good or bad, whether or not a lot of the concerns were whether they just purely instrumentalize your morality and turns it into just a point scoring exercise, and people don't actually think morally about their choices. They just go and choose the thing that is labeled good. And there were lots of research that is based on player ethnography or sort of deep readings of games, but very little mass getting lots of people to play a game and see what happens. And so we wanted to look into that and get some real data on how do morality meters actually change people's decisions. And we had a bunch of different kinds of ethical decisions we wanted to represent in the game, and we wanted to show how different kinds of morality meters telling you different kinds of morality, whether or not they had effect on the player. In order to do this, we looked at existing games, but there's very few games out there that are short enough to play in a research setting that give us the explicit mechanics and control over those mechanics in the way that we wanted as designers to change up the design, and all those sort of factors, and allow us to measure the things we want to measure. And so we thought, okay, well, we really need to make our own game in order to do this properly, and that way we have the full source to the game. We can change any design, make any design changes we want. And so we specifically designed this game, The Great Fire, which you can play on our webpage, and moralityplay.org. Actually, it's on moralityplay.itch.io. You can, in the game, we engaged a creative writing academic from Macquarie and a local game development team, Chaos Theory Games. And they helped write the game and develop the game and produce a beautiful, it's sort of a film noir-esque game set in a cinema in sort of 1940s country Australia. And it's you play an usher at the cinema, and it tells the story. It's sort of a visual novel style game telling the story of one tragic day at work. And as such, you have a lot of difficult moral decisions to make along the way. And we were able to then, record exactly what players were doing in those moral decisions and present a variety of different morality meters there, showing, kind of the different. So we had one sort of morality meter which recommended the obviously intuitively good choices were all labeled as good, and the obviously intuitively evil choices were labeled as evil. Although we did have some choices that were actually sort of closer to being trolley problem dilemmas, where there wasn't clearly one good or evil. And so we were interested then in seeing how changing that meter around, recommending some things as good and some things as evil, would change players' behavior. And so this is, by making our own game, we then ran an experiment. We've run lots of experiments. The nice thing about having our own game is we can keep coming up with another experiment idea and doing a different version of it. But the first one that Paul talked about, we ran a qualitative study where we got
25. We had two groups play the game, basically. With one group had the intuitive meter setting. So I think there were 7 or 8 key choices. So we wanted them to be nicely structured. So we had basically morality versus self-interest type choices, and a contact and non-contact version. So one, you sort of trip over someone and steal their money. One, the money's just there and you steal it. We had 2 trolley problems, which are basically deontological versus consequentialist type decisions. So one is a version of the standard trolley problem where you pull a lever. There was a version of that. One is a version of the one where you push the large man off the bridge. In our case, you had to kick a chair off somebody. And then we had a nominal choice, a coin toss, which should have been 50-50. So we wanted to see, okay, how's a meter impact something like that? And we had another choice in the end, which sort of came up organically about getting revenge on the evil person who does all this damage, or you could hand him over to the police. And so, as Malcolm said, one group got what we'd consider the intuitive thing. So doing in the morality versus self-interest, doing the moral thing would count as intuitive. So stealing would count as evil, and not stealing would count as good. And the other group had that flipped around. So stealing suddenly says good, not stealing says evil. And likewise with the others. Now, of course, the trolley problems, it's much more ambiguous. Although most people think you should pull the lever.
We should probably explain what the trolley problem is, just in case some listener doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, so trolley problems are widely studied in moral psychology. There's a lot of studies on them. And they come out of Philippa Foot's work around moral philosophy. And basically the idea is, okay, imagine there's a runaway train. It's hurtling down the track. There's a lever there. There's 3 people on the track. If you don't do anything, the train's going to run over and kill those 3 people. If you pull this lever, it'll turn the train into another path and it'll kill 1 person. What do you do? Well, most people think, in that case, pull the lever, save the 3. Unfortunately, you've killed 1. Now, there's a variation called what's called the fat man or large man version, where you imagine there's a bridge. So the same thing, there's a runaway train. Once again, there's 3 people on the track. But instead of pulling a lever to stop the train killing the 3, you have to push a large man off a bridge. Now, you can't go off yourself, you're too thin or something like that, but the large man will somehow stop a train. I don't know how that's supposed to happen, but anyway.
It's a trolley. It's supposed to not weigh a whole lot. Like his intestines will get into the wheels. I really don't know how this is supposed to work.
This is where the hand waving comes in. And anyway, so but then most people think, well, actually, no, it'd be wrong to push this large guy off the bridge. And then the question is, well, what's the difference, right? In both cases, 1 person's dying, 3 people are being saved. Why is it okay to pull a lever but not push a large guy? And there's lots of answers people give. One, you're using the large man as a mere means. In the other case, there's just a foreseen side effect but not intended consequence. And there's the doctrine of double effect and all sorts of philosophical issues, which are not that interesting here. So what we wanted, though, is to put equivalent versions into our game. And the reason that they're interesting is because there are competing moral concerns, right? It's good to save the 3, but, is it all right to, use up close personal violence in one case or impersonal levers to in the other case? So basically what we found was really interesting. Now, of course, it's only a small study, so that needs to be kept in mind, and Malcolm will talk about a bigger study afterwards. But basically, we went through and looked at, coded the various themes that people brought up, and we found 4 main sorts of issues when we asked people about how they, thought about the meter or engaged with the meter. And one of them was, 2 of them were about indifference or rejecting the meter. So about half the people just said, I ignored it, didn't pay any attention to it, or deliberately put it aside or rejected it or something like that. So about half the people in both our groups, whether the meter was intuitive or not intuitive, just rejected or indifferent to it. So I think that's an interesting finding. About half the people just didn't engage with the meter at all, didn't particularly like it, didn't want it influencing their decisions. They wanted to make the decisions on their own merits, not what the meter told them to do. But the, I think, more interesting finding is that in our intuitive group, the most common theme was treating the meter as a guide, as a moral guide. So people would say things like, I didn't just follow it, but it made me sort of stop and think, or it gave me, without that, I would have just kind of done whatever, but it made me think seriously about what was going on, or, it got me thinking about this, or, so it was actually they actually treated it as kind of useful moral guide.
So was the idea that they know that they're being judged in some way because they know it's going to affect where they are in the meter? Is that the idea?
Okay, so, these are all self-report things. This is what people tell us.
Right, so we don't know.
Right. What's actually going on? We get to in a second when we look at the quantitative study where we actually see, is it making a difference or not? But what people told us was, that they were taking into account, they were making them think about what to do and so on. So that was the most common when it was an intuitive meter. But when we look at the non-intuitive meter group, it flipped around. That was the least common theme. And the most common theme was treating the meter as a score. So they thought, so things like, I I thought it was the wrong thing to do, but it said it was 15 good, so I just did it. Or I was already on 90, and so I did it because I wanted to get to 100 on my meter. Or other people would sort of have different sort of methods. Like they might say, I want to sort of keep my meter about halfway, so this one was plus 15 evil, that would get me back about halfway, so I picked that. So we can think of these two approaches as a kind of a much more kind of an instrumental relationship to the meter, and a kind of more, I guess, intrinsic relationship where they're sort of, it's getting to think about morality. So it's really interesting when the meter was non-intuitive, people just instrumentalized the meter a lot more. It was just another mechanic, another score to be optimized or do what you want with. It was kind of meaninless in a sense to them morally. It wasn't promoting reflection or anything like that. Whereas, but if in the more intuitive meter, it was tending to do that much more often. So I thought that was a really interesting finding, that it did seem to lead to this more reflective play if it was intuitive, and instrumental play if it was non-intuitive.
So, the difference between the intuitive meter and the non-intuitive meter is?
The non-intuitive meter is flipped around so that every choice that you might intuitively think of as good was labeled evil, and vice versa.
I see.
Stealing money
was
you. Good, you get points for good. Kicking a dog, one of the most controversial choice amongst all the players was there's one choice where there's just a harmless dog sitting there, and it says, do you want to kick the dog or not kick the dog? And if we say, that was the choice that, surprisingly, of all of the choices, that was the one that, people just said, no, there's no way of kicking the dog. There was a choice at the end whether you want to shoot a guy, and people were much happier with that idea than they were with just kicking a dog. Although there was one person in the study who played with the counterintuitive meter and just made every single choice, because when I asked him, why did you steal the money? It's because the meter says it was good. Why did you kick the dog? Because the meter says it was good, and just did the thing. So, I mean, a lot of our results are general, very generalized, but there are some people who react very differently to this thing. So some people who would completely ignore it and say, no, I paid no attention to the meter at all, I just did my own thing. And some people who went, yep, I did what the meter told me, and that was the whole game for me.
Do you suppose that some of that has to do with, if it's a non-intuitive meter, it's creating some sort of friction? Like, I have to resolve the difference between the cognitive dissonance between my what I think is good and what this game is telling me is good.
Yeah, that's definitely something we found in the next study, which we'll tell you about in a second. So first thing we found is that we also looked at reaction time, and we found that when that first time they got that counterintuitive thing, it was a very long reaction time because they're thinking, whoa, what's going on? And they're trying to process it. We also had in the second study, which Malcolm will talk about in a minute, a mixed meter, which was intuitive up until the trolley problems, and then it was flipped around. And so that was trying to create exactly what you said, trying to get over that cognitive dissonance, trying to get some trust, and then flipping it around and looking at the impacts.
Let's hear. All right. So what did you guys find out there? Yeah.
Yeah. So like Paul said, we ran we ran 4 versions, baseline with no meter at all, just to see how people would normally play the game, and then the intuitive meter, which recommending everything you would normally think of as good. The counterintuitive meter, which was everything that you normally think of as good as evil, and then the mixed meter, which started off for the first sort of 5 or 6 decisions, it was doing the intuitive thing: don't kick the dog, don't steal the money, don't everything like that. And they got to the trolley problems, and we switched them over. And so we said, what happens if we switch these?
I should say what the rating was in the trolley problem. Actually, that would probably help. So our first the standard trolley problem, the pull the lever case. We said that the intuitive thing, the good thing to do is to pull the lever, because most people in the trolley problem think the good thing to do is pull the lever. In the large man version, the push off the bridge version, which in our case you have to kick a chair off somebody, which would hang them, most people tend to think that it's wrong to push the large guy off the bridge, or in this case, kick the chair off. So the intuitive thing in that case was not to kill the one person. And
the baseline results without the meters reflected this throughout. Like, people would mostly do the intuitively good thing. There was still 10% of people who kicked the dog. And one of the things that people did talk about in the qualitative study was, well, it's just a game. I wanted to see what would happen, things like that. Or otherwise, people would also say it's a game. I'm going to get rewarded for being good or I'm going to get punished for being evil. So people had expectations of how the game would respond. We designed the game to be, it's a very linear narrative. I mean, for people at home, yeah, your choices really matter. But we didn't, it was only the meter that really told you anything about that. So is there a question?
Yeah, it's interesting with a setup like that, knowing that people are going to interpret the usefulness of the meter differently. How do you get good results when you know that for some people, that some people will take the meter seriously and other people will essentially use it as a mechanic that they think they're just supposed to follow in order to do well in the game?
Yeah, so we deliberately avoided telling them anything about the meter. None of the instructions mention it at all. So what we are wanting to try to measure that is saying, well, how do people respond to this at all? We're not telling you should do the good thing. There's nothing in the game. There's no game instructions at all, but there's nothing in the game that says this is what you should be doing. All there is a bar at the top of the screen with the word good at one end and the word evil at the other end, and it moves. And so that very minimal, people put whatever meaning they expect onto that. And some of our players would have been people who had played games before and would recognize that as a sort of thing. And that came through in the qualitative study. There were definitely people who played this sort of game before and knew what this meant. But there are also people who were just responding to it as, yeah, there's a thing on the screen that's telling me that I'm good. What does that mean?
I should just quickly add that in those big choices where the meter was affected, it did come up like in this choice, it would say, kick the dog plus 15 good, don't kick the dog minus 15 or plus 15 evil. So it was clear before you made the choice that this would affect the meter in this way.
Yeah, for the sake of the experiment, we wanted to be upfront about that. It was something we sort of went back and forth with in the design. We figured it was necessary for a lot of games have these things hidden, but are ultimately you're doing the same sort of behaviors over and over again. So you do learn what the morality is attached to things, or you can go spoil yourself, but reading spoilers about how many karma points something is worth. We wanted to be upfront about that to let you know what the effect was going to be, because there wasn't enough game sort of to learn to predict what the meter might be rewarding you for. So the interesting thing in the baseline data was that, our expectations were validated. People mostly chose the good options, for the intuitively good options for everything, except for the large man or the footbridge problem version, which was in our game. It was your boss. There's a mad. I'm spoiling the game, so if you want to go play the game and come back. But in this scene, there's a crazy guy on the loose killing people and setting fire to things and whatever. And there's one scene where he sets up your boss is standing on a chair with a noose around his neck, and he tells you there's a bomb wired to another room where the other people will die. And if he says, if you don't kick the chair now and kill your boss, I will blow up the room and kill the three other people. And this, in the baseline data, we got exactly 50-50 in people wanting to, 50% people chose to kill their boss and save 3 lives, and 50% of people chose to do the opposite, to say no, they wouldn't kill it, and then 3 people died. And I thought that was really interesting, because we had a real moral dilemma there that didn't have a clear, intuitively good thing to do. And this was where we could really see, well, is the meter going to affect that? Is the meter going to sway people's opinions one way or another? And the data was interesting in that it depended on the type of the meter, and it depended on the type of decision. And so for the early decisions where there was an intuitively good choice, people largely weren't affected by the meter. Giving them a meter which said, you should steal money, you should kick the dog, like Paul said, there was this reaction time where people were like, wait, what? I don't understand why that's good. But then very quickly, people just seem to learn to ignore the meter and say, I'm going to do the good thing anyway. I'm not going to steal money just because the meter says it's good. I'm not going to kick a dog just because the meter says it's good. Which sort of validates, there's some existing research which says, yeah, people play good regardless of what you tell them to do in most of these games. And so that was, in line with previous research. But then we came to these trolley problems and we said, well, okay, what do people do here? And again, if the meter had been telling you, obviously the meter had been telling you good things, so if the meter had been telling you, evil things all along. If the meter had saying kick the dog, if the meter had been saying steal the money, the meter had no effect on the trolley problems. It was still 50-50 in that case. So people just had learnt that meter is not a moral guide, I'm going to ignore it. And people would seem to make choices the same way as before. But if the meter had been telling you good things all along, then get to that choice. And then we had two versions of the meter at that point. One which had been telling you good and said, okay, kick the chair, and one which had been telling you good and said, don't kick the chair. And that seemed to sway people. People seemed to go, oh, right, okay, so the meter is this trustworthy guide. It's been matching my personal morality, although we don't have any way to assess whether or not that, but at least it's been telling me things that are intuitively good. And then at that point, there was a significant difference between the people who were told, yeah, kick the chair is a good thing, and the people who were told, don't kick the chair is a good thing. So at that point, the meter was acting. So it didn't seem like their behavior was consistent with people just trying to optimize the meter. It seemed very much more like people were taking this as a point of data in their decision making, in their moral choice at that point.
A second opinion. Here's one that's hard for me. Let me look and see what the meter asks.
Yeah, and that was consistent with some of the verbal feedback we were getting from people in the qualitative study. What I'm interested in exploring, and what we didn't think to do in this experiment, although we have done in later experiments, is to ask them after the fact, what did you use to make your decisions? And we've asked in a similar study. We've done a similar study since, which we haven't published yet, where we have data with, rather than telling you this is good and this is evil, we've told you most people chose this, 60% of people chose this, 60% of people chose that. So a classic kind of Walking Dead style thing, but again, presented on the screen when you're making the choice. Mm-hmm. And again, that seems to, and I haven't completed this is sort of preliminary data, but that seems to also sway people's opinion. If you say 60% of people kick the chair, people will favor that choice. If you say 60% of people didn't, people favor that choice. And after that study, we asked them in a survey, what was the foundation for your decision making? What factors did you use? And was it your rating, your personal morality, the value, trying to do the good thing on the meter, trying to do the evil thing on the meter, trying to just do things for people you like in the game, trying to progress the narrative of the game, lots of different kinds of motivations that we've sort of encountered. And by and large, people said, my personal morality was the thing that drove my decisions in the game. And we asked, did you try to optimize the meter in any way? They said, no, not at all. I was not influenced by the meter. Strongly disagreed with the idea that they were influenced by the meter, which was interesting because clearly they were influenced by the meter. We're doing more variations of this study, and this is something that I want to look into a bit more deeply, is how much do people think they're being influenced by these factors versus how much are they actually doing it. And so the next study that we want to do is an eye tracking study. We want to see actually, how much attention are they paying to the meter at any point in time while playing the game.
I would think if you're actually telling them, how many other people, let's say, chose this particular option, I mean, the bandwagon effect has got to play a role in all this, even though.
So were you changing in real time the number of people so they could they see themselves like?
No. So the data was all based on the previous study and then faked appropriately to change up versions that we want for the decisions we wanted to test.
Gotcha. So it wasn't dynamic data. It was static. Okay.
It was all, yeah.
But as far as they knew, it could have been dynamic, all right?
Yeah.
Or right. Okay. I want to go now to making the kind of big moral judgments that we're used to in video games. So my moral engagement with the game here is that I get to choose whether to do X or Y, right? So I decide whether to save the Krogan race in Mass Effect or to risk the possibility that they'll unleash their wrath upon the galaxy later on, or I get to decide whether to euthanize my best friend in Life is Strange, as she's asking me to do, or to live the rest of her life as a quadriplegic. So these are kind of, every player is familiar with these kind of decisions. How are decisions like these supposed to engage us with morality? And from what you guys found, do they actually work as intended?
So to go back to the moral psychology stuff we talked about at the beginning, one of the problems I think especially with this sort of morality meter research, and also these very big binary choices. Do you do the good thing or the evil thing, or do you do the sort of choice between things? Is when we look at how people actually make moral choices in real life. There's a model that we tend to follow in drawing from moral psychology called the 4-component model. Moral psychologist James Rest and colleagues and a lot of people following in his tradition say that there are really 4 different sort of cognitive processes that are going on when we're doing ethics, and they're moral motivation or moral focus, which is your drive to do the moral thing in the first place. Moral sensitivity, which is your ability to read a situation, see that it is a moral situation, because moral situations don't present themselves to us as here is a moral thing, and see what the salient factors are and look at, to read the world in a moral way. Moral judgment, which is then making the decision, deciding what it is that you're supposed to do, and using, whatever sort of factors that, influence your moral choice. And then moral action, which is to go out and actually put that action into effect in the world. And usually, being moral is not an easy thing. And the problem with a lot of games from this model is that we really reduce that down to moral judgment is the thing that we're doing. Here is, and we say, okay, we don't sort of eliminate moral sensitivity by saying, here is a moral choice. It's heavily signposted in the game as there is a moral question here. Here are the 2 options you can make, and you just have to sort of choose between those options. And then also sort of removing moral action, because often it's just like, okay, make the dialogue choice that chooses that thing, and then you don't have to put it into effect.
Right. It's one click either way.
Yeah, one click, I do that thing, and it's clearly I'm going to do, yes, there's nothing about making a hard choice. Well, the choice itself might be difficult, but there's nothing, once you've made the choice, you go click and it's done. And so what we're interested in is some of these big choices do present themselves in those ways. And traditionally we've had, very much this focus on here is an option, what do you do? We're interested in is thinking about this as design advice for looking into those other kinds of moral components that they're bringing to bear, and thinking about how to design for those. And so thinking about how to design a moral, how to let the player sort of read in the different moral things rather than hand them the moral problem, which some of those bigger choices do. I mean, Life is Strange doesn't, then it's more in the narrative about, well, what are the moral questions here? It doesn't hand you often you have the 2 people saying you should do this and you should do that, and you have to choose. When you have a richer narrative and you have more going on, people will read in lots of different factors. In fact, we found this in our game. One of the last decisions you make in the game is choosing whether or not to kill the bad guy, or to hand him over to the police, and people would report the name of the town was Mayhem. One player said, just the very first introductory text presents the name of the town as Mayhem, and they said, I didn't think, in a town called Mayhem, I didn't think that the police would be trustworthy, and so I thought I should take the law into my own hands. And so read those other elements of the narrative into that moral choice.
Right.
And so we're very capable of taking a much bigger and richer concerns than as designers, we often feel like we need to lay out, here are arguments for one side and here are arguments for the other side, and choose. And the sort of lens of moral sensitivity suggests, well, look, give the player, respect the player's moral sensitivity, respect the fact that they can read the details of a larger situation and make up their own mind and bring to bear factors that we may, as designers, may have never even considered are a part of that decision. And I think big narrative games like Life is Strange really do that, in that it's not just, here is a moral, it's not your Mass Effect. You walk up to a couple of strangers and who ask you whether or not solve this moral problem for us. Here it is. Right. What do you do? This is a person you've been living and being friends with for hours of play already. You have this established relationship, and lots going on in this one decision that you're making at this point in time.
I was going to say, I think it's useful then to break it down into those different components, right? So Life is Strange, for example, moral action is still very easy. It is just click this or click that. But things like moral focus, well, there's lots of reasons why you might care about morality. There's lots of competing interests. You've got your relationship and all the rich narrative that's been going on. And sensitivity, likewise, it doesn't just sort of flag this is a moral issue or not a moral issue. Is your relationship with the other characters, is that a moral issue or not a moral issue? How does that relate to other like it's not so we can think about like, so sensitivity could be quite difficult. Like, what exactly is morally relevant here or not? That could be quite challenging. Moral focus, you've got personal relationship, and how does that weigh up with morality? Once again, that could make moral focus quite difficult. Judgment, it's obviously a difficult thing to do, but then moral action, it's pretty easy. You just sort of click a button or that button. So we can think how different games and different ways of designing games can make some of those components either easier or harder, or engage with those skills in different sorts of ways. And it's not like every game was going to do all those things. It's fine, and not every game has to. It's fine that say moral action is easy in this game, but these other ones might be hard. But it's just a matter of like thinking through, how does a game engage with these different aspects? Are they kind of easy or hard? Does the designer want to engage with those? And also but I guess the important thing is thinking more broadly than there's more to morality than ask someone to make a judgment. That's just, sure, that's one thing you can do, but there's all these other things too.
There certainly were people, interesting on that topic, there were people who in the early choices did something immoral just to try. And then we did a focus group discussion. So there was like 2 or 3 people talking, and they were so embarrassed by making that choice. Like the people who reported those things were like, I didn't realize where it was going. Like they were like, I thought it was just a game. I thought I could just steal this money and it would be fine. And the guy you steal the money from comes back later in the game and actually helps you survive and things like that. And they're like, if I'd known what kind of game it was or where it was going, I would never have made that choice. So there was a point at which it turned for them from being just a game and something that I can do what I like and explore things to, no, this is a story that I'm invested in and I care about the characters that I'm doing. I think that as a designer, that's sort of comes to that question of moral focus, is how do we as designers get people to engage? It's very tempting as a game to just game it, right? Most of our games are amoral spaces where we don't ask the player to even think about the morality of what they're doing, and that's fine. Games are meant to be sandboxes where we can mess around, but we also want in some games to say, no, this is a game where your morality matters. And so that's a moral focus question of how do we get you into the game in a way that says your choices here, you need to be thinking about the morality of your choices in this game. Whereas, in your average shooter, you're not going to go, oh my God, should I shoot this person or not? It's like, games don't bring that to bear.
I really like the idea of focusing more on moral sensitivity, right? Because, there's tons of choices that lead to ethical reflection, and some where you can put your controller down and think about it for a half hour before deciding. But it's also supposed to be about reasons. And I'm curious, I'm trying to remember in Life is Strange, since we were talking about that, I think there's a scenario where, let's say there's a kid on the quad who seems, lonely. And, you have the opportunity, but the game is not going to force you to let's say, come up and talk to that fellow student, right? That's, let's say, an opportunity that might test your moral sensitivity, or it might get you to be the kind of player that just checks out every option, right? But I'm curious about if you guys know some games that you think might have been well designed to explore the moral sensitivity that players might have for the situation. And if you do, is the idea then because I can see a situation where you encounter characters that, things will happen in your interaction that they will think are morally important, but your character might have not realized. And later on, they could essentially, in the conversation, come back to you, perhaps upset, perhaps happy, because of how things morally turned out according to how they saw it. But you might not have an idea. I'm just kind of curious if you guys have any ideas of how to do the moral sensitivity part well.
Something that I find very interesting in this is most of our games do, signpost, here is a moral choice and whatnot. And so we've been thinking a little bit about how do you step back, how do you design a game to not tell the player that they're making moral choices, and part of that comes back to sort of making the game more systemic and more generic in the choices that you're making, and there's not one scripted choice that has, this is the moral choice and these are the options. It's here is a system with a number of choices that you're making along the way, and there is a moral arc to that gameplay, but there isn't necessarily, a moment where you're making the moral choice. You're making a bunch of choices and they have moral impact in the end. And so we actually did just an investigation looking at Papers, Please in this regard as a more systemic, systems-driven game where there is ethics to what you're doing in the game. But there are some scripted moments where you're making, clearly a scripted choice, but there's also just an overall moral arc to what you're doing and whether or not you feel like you came away as a good person in that game. And so this is a very interesting kind of different way of approaching morality in games, is rather than saying here is a moral choice, it's like here is a system which has moral consequence. Similar games, Frostpunk does that well, I think, where there, again, sort of it's more of a management sim that you're playing there, but overall the choices you make have sort of moral impact and there are various sort of ways of reading that in there. And those sorts of games then require more of you as a player to bring moral focus to the game, because it's not in your face saying here is a moral choice, do you euthanize your friend? It's here is the society you have to run. There are competing interests. At the end of the day, are you a good person? And also, it also challenges you for moral action, because it says, you want to do the right thing. You want to do the good thing in Papers, Please. You want to let through the people you want to be nice to the people you want. You actually have to be good at the game to do that. You can't just go, I'm going to do the good thing and get good points. It's like, I really want to do the good thing, but I'm so bad at this game that I'm on the verge of losing and I can't. My child is sick and whatever, and I need to actually get better at the game in order to be allowed to exercise my morality within the game.
Yeah, it seems like you would want to have low value decisions early on, just to get people sort of used to the kinds of decisions that they're making, so that they can explore the kinds of agency that they have in the game and the kinds of decisions that they're going to come.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it gets us to come back to something we talked about at the start around moral expertise. It's too often like we don't treat morality as something that can be difficult or hard or easier, and we just sort of throw people in. But if we think about like how a game always starts with some sort of tutorial system. Like this is how you use the system. It's the opponents start off easy, get harder, because you're supposed to progress and get better. But we often don't think of morality that way in games as well. We just sort of throw people in but the sort of thing you're suggesting, and something we've sort of written about as well, once we sort of think about more as an expertise or a skill, it's something that you can start off with sort of simpler types of dilemmas, where there's kind of an obvious answer, and you can get sort of different kind of feedback from that. But then slowly kind of ramp up morality in the same way you might ramp up the toughness of bosses or something like that. So yeah, I think that's definitely right. Is to sort of think about all the different aspects. You might ramp up sensitivity or something like that, or action, but do that gradually so the player gets kind of experience and gets better at it. And once again, like Papers, Please is kind of good like that, in that there's just all these little decisions you have to make all the time, and it's not obvious. I mean, it's really exploring this idea of the banality of evil, how just having your standard motives, like I want to do my job, I want to feed my family, can lead you to be involved in evil actions. And it does, and that's what I think the sensitivity is intentionally difficult in that game, because you've got you've got to feed your family, it's cold at night, you've got little money, so you kind of want to focus on that. But then there's people pleading for their lives coming through. So you've kind of, you're so busy sometimes you've got to be very quick with the game makes you focus very quickly on the processing the passports, and so it's almost pushing you. Don't just ignore the dialogue quickly, just quickly process. But of course you're missing the kind of the moral point as well. So in that sense it does a really good job. Another one I quite like, this is more about moral action, is in The Walking Dead, the first one. There's this really nice, a lot of them choices are just simple, do this, do that. But there's this really nice one where Lee is trying to stop, I think Kenny. Kenny's driving a train. He's really upset. I think his son's just got infected or something like that. And the dialogue choice is not like get him to stop without violence or use violence. It's like you have to make about 8 or 9 decisions in dialogue choices in a row. And they're quite a degree of kind of, emotional intelligence. Like what's going to anger him, what's going to calm him down, what's going to frustrate him, what's not. And, you've got to make, like I said, 8 or 9 choices in a row. And only when you've done that will you sort of be able to talk him down without violence. So instead of just saying, talk him down with violence or not, you've got to actually have moral skill in this case, moral action skills around emotional sensitivity or or things like that. Or you can imagine other sort of things like communication skills or leadership skills are needed to actually achieve a moral goal rather than just say click a box. So I think that's another nice example.
It's interesting how much of this is, engaging in personal relationships with people and thinking in terms of personal relationship instead of these kind of trolley problem examples, which are, really abstract or really dealing with, people that you don't have, let's say, relationships with, right? Because digging into these relationships kind of connects with you seeing a person from a variety of dimensions, hopefully. And I'm curious how things like that stack against interpersonal morality. Sorry, against impartial morality, right? So you have this interpersonal morality, let's say with Kenny in the first Walking Dead, right? He's your friend. How should you treat your friend? There's a point where you think he's not doing the right thing. And this is a kind of a nice thing. I think there's another dilemma in that first one. You have loyalty to him as a friend, right? And you're aware that as a friend, you have certain obligations to him as a friend, right? And you're aware that he's very upset, but he also wants to do something that seems, from the point of view of impartial morality, and I don't remember what it is, but it seems like unjust in some way, right? And I thought that contrast was really nice. But again, that contrast, you need to make a moral judgment, but it's not just a moral judgment. It's also, how do you manage the moral expectations of your friends, right? And managing moral expectations, I think, was the more interesting part.
Yeah, I mean, and that once again that pulls on a bunch of different skills there. Like, so it's one you might think it's moral focus. Is it am I sort of prioritizing my friendship over morality? But there's also moral sensitivity. Like, are some of these other kind of moral dimensions to my relationship with this other person? It's not clearly like this is moral or not moral. And so I think once again, what are you being sent? What are the morally salient issues here? Is the fact that I'm a friend and I have this deep relationship with him, is that morally salient? And how does it weigh up with other morally salient features? So I think that, I think this actually is what's a really good feature of game. I mean, Malcolm talks about this idea of games as a sandbox, but we can also think about it as a way to explore ethics, as a way to explore morality. And that's one of those cases where there are genuine different competing ethical considerations. And so, it's about what are you prioritizing, what are you sensitive to, as well as the kind of judgment and implementing it as well. And I think it's nice that we can sort of explore those. And a game doesn't have to tell you which one of those is the moral one or not moral. It can be partly up to you. But I just want to quickly touch on another thing you mentioned there, like the interpersonal relation. And I think when we think about morality day to day, it's pretty much usually interpersonal stuff.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that's right. That's the bread and butter of morality for most of it. We're not all facing these big life and death decisions all the time. Maybe some of us face that some of the time, but they're not the sort of everyday moral decisions we have to sort of face every day. And so I think, getting those in games as well, like thinking about how to put them in games and letting people explore those, I think is also important aspect too.
Another theory of moral psychology, the moral foundations theory, which talks about, it's based in the idea of intuitive morality and says that there are 5, maybe 6 different sort of moral priorities that different people sort of rate at different levels of importance. And if I can remember them all, concerns about justice and fairness, concerns about care versus harm, concerns about purity, authority, and loyalty to your in-group, and liberty and freedom. And there's evidence that different groups in different societies will put priority on some of those over others. In Western society, more liberal people will put priority on fairness, care, and liberty, and more conservative people put relatively more priority on authority and loyalty and purity, which is interesting. And I think there's some evidence that people do respond in game in following these sorts of foundations, and so there are measures to say what are your foundations, what are your priorities, and look, if you present these kinds of choices in games. But I also think they make for really interesting material as game designers to say, okay, I want to design a choice. We lean heavily on the trolley problem a lot of times, these utilitarian versus sort of deontological choices, but there are other kinds of dilemmas that challenge us in more interesting ways and are more sort of really natural kinds of dilemmas, rather than, we very rarely have this do I save, how many people do I save kind of choices in real life. But we do often have choices between, do I do the caring thing or do I do the fair thing? Like as a teacher, I encounter this all the time. There's a student who's, for whatever reasons, hasn't done their assignment and comes to you with some sob story, and I'm faced with a moral dilemma. Do I care for this person? The caring thing to do right now would be to say, okay, that doesn't matter, just do the work and we'll give you the mark. The fair thing is to treat all students equally, and there are other students who didn't come to me with those problems and who have just submitted the best work that they could within the deadline. And the fair thing would be to treat them all equally and say to this student, no, I can't do that. And so I think as designers, these moral foundations are a really good way of thinking about these sort of much more natural, everyday kind of decisions. Do I do the thing that is looking after my friends versus do I obey the person who's in authority over me? Do I do the taboo thing, or do I do the thing that's going to make me feel uncomfortable versus do I actually be caring or whatever in this circumstance? And so I think that gives us much more meat as designers than these sort of big utilitarian, deontological, philosophical moral choices.
I believe there are sort of online, take this quiz and get your moral foundation ratings things, right? Are they of any value?
Well, I mean, they are. The big one is actually made by the researchers who do this work, and so presumably the Moral Foundations questionnaire you can actually take online, and that is actually one of the most. There's more data validating that as a survey than basically any kind of psychological instrument that I've investigated in this field at all. They have done massive worldwide studies of that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like any of these things. It's very much based on self-report. And so it's like, which of these things do you prioritize? And so it is to some degree representative of your self-image of yourself as a moral person, and maybe not. One of the interesting questions there is: does your behavior reflect your what you say on the moral foundations test?
I'm curious if you could take. I was a huge fan of Ultima 4 when I was in middle school, and I was 13 when I played it, I'm thinking because in Ultima 4, right, you're engaging in actions that are then correlated to virtues, and you get points and their morality systems for virtue. It's interesting if someone could do something like that, but instead of kind of these morality meters, you're shifted to some sort of, because in the beginning of Ultima 4, you're asked kind of these moral dilemmas that create what your persona is in the game, where your moral meter starts. I wonder if something like that could be done in a game that incorporates these core values in some sort of test that sets up your character in the game in accordance with whatever kind of value system you have. I've been dying to see anything like Ultima 4 for years, just because it's such a personal favorite.
This is something to relate back to the morality meter research. We talked earlier about the idea of reputation as well as being sort of competing meters or different ways of moral standards in the world. And a study that I, again, want to do when I get time to make, but we have to make a new game, and making a game takes forever. But I want to make a game which does pit these different moral foundations against each other and presents you with, well, maybe just another meter, but a meter that has more axes that show you, yeah, you're sitting here in the moral world at the moment. This choice is going to give you points in justice, and this choice is going to give you points in care. And the idea there is sort of I'm interested in exploring the idea of moral role play, where it's not. Often we go, I'm going to play a good player, or I'm going to play an evil player, but we do set into a game to say, I'm going to play evil, and it's moral role play. It's not reflecting my values. It's like I want to be a villain. But I'm interested in these games which give you this richer set of okay, well, I'm going to role play a person who's really caring and really kind, or I'm going to role play a person who really cares about justice, and that's the primary driver. And maybe it's less a reflection of my personal morality and more a choice of a character that I want to play in the game, and using these meters then as a guide for moral role play rather than as a measurement of my morality. Excuse me.
But I can say, as a big role player, I have done a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, D&D with its lawful, chaotic kind of gives you different approaches to morality. Even you say I'm going to be good, I can be lawful good, I can be obeying the rules, or I can be chaotic good, I can be ignoring the rules and just doing whatever matters. And I think giving the player more room for that kind of moral role play, I think will lead to more interesting and richer games in a sense.
For sure.
There's a game by an Australian studio coming out this year called Broken Roads, which I'm really keen to see because it sort of expands this idea of the morality meter to represent different moral philosophies in your morality meter. I'm very excited to see it. We've had a bit of chat with the developer about what they're doing, and I'm keen to play that game. My next research paper will be playing that game and reporting back.
Cool. The way you're kind of talking about it, it's mostly games explore 1 out of 4 dimensions of morality. And, what are some of the implications if you're saying, let's look at the other 3 for game designers, players, anyone interested in ethics?
So we wrote a paper, Jesse Schell wrote the book of lenses for game design, where he had this concept where we'll just present they're questions to ask yourself as designers. They're not answers about how to do design. They're very much posed as these sort of prompts. And we wanted to follow in that model and say, well, what is this sort of 4-component model? What are the questions it poses to us designers to ask about our design and to consider these kind of factors? And this is, we didn't want to say, look, this is the way to make the moral game and you have to make your games better because they, the moral choices in games at the moment are good. But I think we have more scope by sitting down and looking at our game and asking, how are we engaging the player's moral sensitivity? Are we handing the moral questions to them, or are we inviting them to do it? How are we engaging the player's moral focus? What is it about our game that invites players to think about playing this game morally? How are we engaging moral action? Are we just click on it and the moral thing happens, or do we have to strategize about our morality? Do we have to be skillful in the dialogue? Do we have to be skillful in some other sense? And I don't think, there's no one sort of answer to these questions. We can bring some of these, we can say, oh yeah, we're totally ignoring that. Moral action is not in this game. But some we can say, but we really want to dive into moral sensitivity. We want to, make the moral problems rich and ambiguous and bring a lot of factors to bear on that. And we're going to do that through narrative or through whatever it might be. So this is where I think, understanding the psychology really just gives us a better set of tools to look at our design as game designers. And that for me is, I come into this with more concern about games than about ethics, in the sense that, I'm not, I believe that a lot of what we're doing can be used to improve, make games that teach ethics and make games that improve ethical development. But for me, moral choices are fun. And as a designer, I want to make more interesting, more meaningful, more sort of adult games where I'm really sort of, like all of our media, wrestles with morality in very interesting ways. It's a big part of what we do for entertainment. And I want to make games which wrestle with that in much more interesting ways. And I think engaging with these moral psychologies gives us those lenses to look at our game and say, how can we make this better by better engaging parts of the player's moral expertise?
Games are sandboxes, and I think it's really interesting the way that we can, role play different ethical personas or explore different ethical situations. So I think games are useful in that way, and that sort of then leads into the stuff Malcolm was talking about. Like, well, if we want that, then we want to think about the ways that we can engage those different aspects of our moral expertise. Malcolm talked, can games teach us to be better? Well, then, what counts as better? How do we do that? One thing we actually work on, another game we haven't talked about yet, is a game we're looking at developing around cybersecurity ethics. And so we have a game that tries to teach sensitivity around cybersecurity ethics. So one thing is what are the ethical issues in cybersecurity? They're not obvious. And so one thing that game's trying to do is, okay, there we're just focusing on sensitivity. How can we make people more aware of what the ethical issues are in cybersecurity in a gaming context? So there's an example of we had a particular goal, we want to improve sensitivity, and then we could design the game to try and achieve that end. So I think just being aware that there are these different components, being kind of conscious and thinking about them, and then as gamers flipping that around, think about how those different components are being engaged with or not being engaged with, are being challenged, not being challenged, and think about more broadly how ethics is put into games and how you engage with ethics in games beyond just like, here's the big choice, what do you do?
All right. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
For me, I think moral psychology is useful to design. And so a lot of what we teach in game design is understanding the player, understanding what the player will do and understanding what the player will feel. And these are the fundamental questions of game design. And how do we design the game to get the player to do what we want them to do and feel what we want them to feel? And understanding player psychology is a big part of that. As a designer, I want to get into the player's head. So if we want to design morally engaging games, then we want to get into the player's moral psychology, and we want to understand how the player's moral thinking works. And so there's a lot we can learn from the existing moral psychology research to say, okay, well, here's what's going on in your player's head when they're making a moral choice in your game. And here are these different components, this sort of moral focus, moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral action, these different components of their thinking that are going on when they're making and executing a moral choice. And as designers, if we can learn about this kind of psychology and use it to reflect on our game designs, we can make games that engage that moral expertise and practice and play that moral expertise more interestingly. And we can also learn more about how do players experience that, how do players experience the difference between having a morality meter telling you what is good versus having to make up their own mind in a difficult situation. And so I would encourage any game designers out there to go and investigate moral psychology. Come to our blog. We have lots of resources from moral psychology research and how they might relate to games. Little plug for moralityplay.org. And then use that as a sort of a lens to think about your design. And for players, think about what you're doing when you're making moral choices in games. Think about, what is it that influenced this particular choice? Was I influenced by, these instrumental factors of the meter or worrying about losing the game? Or was I actually making following my own moral judgment? Or was I morally role-playing in this situation? And do I want to enter into this game in a way that I'm playing a new kind of morality? And gives you more reflection on how you're playing and what your own moral psychology is and why you're making the choices you're making. And then maybe you can think about how that relates to real life.
Malcolm Ryan, Paul Formosa, thank you so much. This was just super interesting. I got my class right after this, and I'm gonna talk to them about the 4 dimensions here. We want to thank you guys. Let's just give my hand in there. All right.
Yeah, that was great. It was really great.
It was a real pleasure. Real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good podcast, guys. GP, play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.